Abandoned on a stormy night, a brave little Beagle and her helpless puppies faced the unthinkable. But what happened when a lonely widower stumbled upon them? From life-threatening danger to heroic rescues and an epic showdown with a vengeful foe. This story will leave you speechless. How far can love and loyalty take you? Stick around to find out. And tell us, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. The storm rolled in like an unstoppable tide, its rumble shaking the earth beneath a desolate dirt road on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. The air hung heavy, thick with moisture and tension. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating a battered pickup truck rattling to a halt. Wesley Morgan, his face twisted in frustration, slammed the driver's door shut and stalked to the back of the truck. "Damn mutt," he muttered under his breath, yanking the tailgate open. A small Beagle looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with confusion and fear. Around her, 3 tiny puppies squirmed and whimpered, oblivious to the cruelty of the moment. Without hesitation, Wes grabbed the Beagle by the scruff, dropping her onto the soaked ground. The puppies followed, spilling out in a tangle of fur. Ellie barked sharply, scrambling to gather her pups. But Wes ignored her, climbing back into his truck as the engine roared to life. The taillights disappeared into the murky gloom, leaving only the sound of pounding rain and Ellie's desperate barking. Ellie chased after the truck for several yards, her paws slipping in the mud. But the truck was gone, swallowed by the storm. Her barks turned to soft whines as she limped back to her puppies, their tiny bodies huddled together in the downpour. Rain drenched her fur, but she stood resolute, nudging her pups toward a hollow tree she'd spotted nearby. The opening wasn't large, but it was enough. One by one, she nosed them inside, curling her body around them to shield them from the cold. Thunder crashed overhead, but Ellie's warmth provided a fragile sense of safety. Miles away, the storm mirrored another kind of turmoil. Eli Thatcher sat in his dimly lit cabin, his hands busy with a block of wood. The rhythmic scrape of his carving knife filled the room, an almost meditative escape from the storm raging outside. He paused, glancing at a photo on the mantel. Evelyn. Her bright smile stared back at him, forever frozen in time. A lump rose in his throat. He looked away, focusing on the unfinished figure in his hands. It was supposed to be a dog, but the ears weren't quite right. Evelyn had loved dogs. She had loved life. Now the cabin felt too large, too quiet, without her laugh echoing off its walls. The rain continued to hammer down as Eli stood to check the fire. He reached for his jacket. Firewood. He would need more for the long night ahead. Out near the creek, the wind howled through the trees, carrying faint sounds beneath it. Eli stopped mid-step, straining to listen, whimpering. He adjusted the lantern in his hand and followed the sound, his boots squelching through the mud. A few yards away, near the base of a tree, he saw them. A dog, her fur plastered to her thin frame, huddled over 3 small bundles. Her brown eyes met his, filled with exhaustion and suspicion. She growled softly, her body stiffening. "Easy, girl," Eli murmured, crouching low. He held the lantern out, keeping his movements slow. "I'm not here to hurt you." Ellie's growls quieted, but her body remained coiled like a spring, ready to defend her pups. Eli set the lantern down and knelt in the mud. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, Ellie lowered her head. Her ears twitched as if trying to decide whether to trust this man. Eli took off his coat, spreading it across his lap. "Come on now," he coaxed, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Let's get you and those babies somewhere warm." The Beagle hesitated but allowed him closer. Eli carefully wrapped the shivering puppies in his coat, their small bodies barely stirring. Ellie followed, her gaze never leaving him. Together they trudged back toward the cabin, rain soaking them both to the bone. Inside, warmth greeted them like an old friend. Eli set the puppies down near the fire, drying them gently with an old towel. Ellie sniffed each one, checking for harm before settling herself protectively between them and the man. Eli shook his head, muttering under his breath. "This is temporary," he said, though the sight of Ellie's unwavering gaze made him falter. He grabbed a pile of old blankets, fashioning a makeshift bed near the fire. Ellie circled once before lying down, her body curling around the puppies. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, but inside the cabin, a quiet stillness took over. Eli sat back in his chair, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. He glanced at Ellie, who looked back at him with weary eyes. Something stirred deep within him, a feeling he hadn't recognized in years. For the first time in a long while, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. Morning broke softly over the cabin, sunlight filtering through the rain-kissed leaves. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean. Inside, Ellie stirred first. She licked her 3 tiny puppies, one by one, her movements deliberate and tender. The smallest of the litter yawned, its fragile paws stretching against her side. She nosed them closer, ensuring their safety, even as her ears perked at every creak of the floorboards. Eli sat across the room, cradling a chipped mug of coffee in his hands. He watched the scene in silence, the warmth of the fire still lingering from the night before. Ellie's protective nature was hard to miss. She growled softly whenever he shifted too suddenly, her amber eyes locked onto his every move. Despite the tension, something about her presence eased the usual heaviness in his chest. "You've got your guard up," Eli muttered, his voice low. "And I can't say I blame you." Ellie's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but she didn't growl this time. Her focus remained on her puppies, nudging them into a tighter huddle before curling around them once more. Eli sipped his coffee, his mind wrestling with the decision he'd tried to avoid all morning. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You're not my responsibility," he murmured, though the words rang hollow. His late wife's voice echoed faintly in his memory. "Every creature deserves a chance, Eli." The memory cut deeper than he cared to admit. But the thought of bringing Ellie and her puppies into town churned uneasily in his gut. He wasn't running a rescue. Hadn't Evelyn's dream of one died with her? And yet leaving Ellie in the cabin wasn't a choice he could bring himself to make. By mid-morning, Eli's battered truck rolled into Asheville, the tires crunching against the gravel lot outside Dr. Maggie Aldridge's clinic. A soft bell jingled as he pushed open the door, a blanket-wrapped Ellie and her puppies held carefully in his arms. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic, mixed with the comforting scent of hay. Maggie looked up from the reception desk, her hazel eyes widening at the sight before her. "Good Lord, Eli," she said, stepping closer. "What happened here?" "Found 'em during the storm," Eli replied gruffly. "Thought you could take a look." Maggie reached out, and Ellie stiffened in his arms, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Maggie paused, her voice soft. "Easy, girl. It's okay." She gestured toward the exam room. "Come on, let's get them checked out." Ellie's growls faded as Maggie moved with practiced care. She examined Ellie first, noting the scars beneath her thin coat and the signs of malnutrition. "She's been through a lot," Maggie murmured, her voice tinged with sadness. "Whoever had her didn't care much about her well-being." "She's lucky I found her," Eli said, though the words felt heavier than he expected. Maggie glanced up, a knowing look in her eyes. "Lucky? Or maybe the two of you needed each other?" Eli grunted in response but didn't argue. Maggie turned her attention to the puppies next, her hands gentle as she examined their small, shivering forms. "They're healthy enough," she said after a moment. "Just underweight. But with care, they'll pull through." She straightened, wiping her hands. "Eli, I have to ask, what's your plan here?" "My plan?" he echoed, his voice defensive. "I'm not exactly running a shelter, Doc. This is temporary." Maggie's gaze softened. "Temporary or not, Ellie's been through enough. She needs stability, not just care. And right now, you're her best shot." The words lingered as Eli carried Ellie and her puppies back to the truck. Outside, a cheerful voice called out, "Well, I'll be. Eli Thatcher with a whole litter of pups?" Eli turned to see Gideon "Gid" Wallace, the local mechanic, leaning casually against his truck. Gid grinned, his overalls stained with grease. "Didn't know you had a soft spot for strays." "I don't," Eli replied curtly, loading the blanket-wrapped puppies into the passenger seat. Gid chuckled, unfazed. "Could have fooled me. Tell you what, if you need tips on raising them, come by the garage. Got a soft spot for dogs myself." With a nod, Gid strolled away, leaving Eli to grumble as he climbed into his truck. Back in Asheville, the news of Eli's new guests spread faster than wildfire. By the time he returned to the cabin, several neighbors had stopped by, some offering supplies while others expressed doubt. "Eli Thatcher taking in a dog and her pups," one woman scoffed. "I'll believe it when I see it." Their words nagged at Eli, adding weight to his already conflicted mind. But when he stepped inside the cabin and saw Ellie waiting near the fire, her puppies nestled close, the noise of the outside world faded. Days passed, and Ellie's wariness began to soften. She no longer growled when Eli approached, and one evening she allowed him to pet her briefly. Her fur was coarse beneath his hand, but her eyes shone with a quiet gratitude he couldn't ignore. That night, as the fire crackled, Ellie surprised him further. She lay her head on his lap, her body relaxing for the first time since the storm. Eli froze, his hand hovering mid-air before gently resting it on her head. "Looks like you're starting to trust me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. But trust was a fragile thing. In a dimly lit bar in Asheville, Wes Morgan leaned against the counter, his eyes narrowing as he overheard a conversation. "Thatcher's got himself a dog and a bunch of pups," a man laughed, slapping his drink on the counter. "Can you believe that?" Wes's expression darkened. "Thatcher, huh?" he muttered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His grip tightened. "Guess I've got unfinished business." Back at the cabin, Eli sat at his kitchen table, the soft scratch of pencil on paper filling the room. He sketched a rough design for a kennel, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ellie watched him from her bed, her pups nestled close. "This is just until you're strong enough," Eli said, though his tone lacked conviction. Ellie's eyes met his, calm and steady, as if she understood more than he realized. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the forest, breathing life into the damp earth after the recent storm. The soft chirping of birds echoed through the trees, mingling with the rustle of leaves as a light breeze stirred the air. On the porch of his cabin, Eli sat with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his gaze fixed on Ellie. Ellie ventured cautiously into the clearing, her movements deliberate, ears perked and nose twitching. Her 3 puppies, emboldened by their mother's calm presence, stumbled and tumbled over each other in playful abandon. A faint smile tugged at Eli's lips as he watched the smallest pup yip excitedly, chasing after a falling leaf. "You're getting brave, girl," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie paused, her sharp eyes scanning her surroundings before settling on Eli. There was no growl this time, only a silent acknowledgement of his presence. Slowly, she returned her attention to her pups, nosing one back toward the makeshift bed on the porch. Eli leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of his coffee and the peaceful scene before him fill the quiet space. Yet, beneath the serenity, a memory stirred, a memory of Evelyn. Her laughter was the first thing he remembered, bright and unyielding as she coaxed a mangy stray out from beneath their porch. "Every life matters, Eli," she'd said, her hands gentle but firm as she cradled the trembling dog. Her dream of opening a rescue shelter had always seemed so big, too big for their modest life. "We can barely take care of ourselves," he'd argued one evening, his frustration spilling over. "You want to take in every stray in the county?" Evelyn's disappointment had been sharper than any retort. "It's not about what we can do, Eli. It's about what we should do." The guilt of that moment lingered now, years later, as he watched Ellie's cautious exploration of a world she was only just beginning to trust. Miles away, the air inside a dingy trailer was thick with the stench of unwashed clothes and cigarette smoke. Wes Morgan slouched at a grimy table, his jaw tight as he stared down the man sitting across from him. "You're late, Morgan," the loan shark sneered, tapping a fat finger against a ledger. "And I don't do charity." Wes's lips curled into a snarl. "You'll get your money." "Better be soon," the man replied, leaning back with a smug grin. "Heard you were good with dogs. Maybe it's time you put that talent to use." The comment landed like a slap. Wes's breeding days had ended in disaster, the abuse allegations and mounting debts too much to outrun. But now, an idea began to take shape in his mind. A cruel, desperate idea. He'd overheard enough in town to know where Ellie had ended up, and her puppies could fetch a good price. A twisted grin spread across his face. "Don't worry, I've got a plan." At Maggie's clinic, the familiar hum of activity filled the air as she reviewed her notes. Ellie's condition had been nagging at her since Eli's visit. Her scars and behavior weren't just signs of neglect, they pointed to something darker. Maggie sighed, speaking aloud to herself as she often did in quiet moments. "This isn't just neglect. Someone's profiting off these animals." The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. She couldn't let it rest. When Eli brought Ellie and her puppies for a follow-up, she shared her suspicions, her voice steady but urgent. "Eli," she began, watching his reaction carefully, "Ellie's injuries. They're consistent with breeding abuse. Whoever had her wasn't just careless. They were using her." Eli's face hardened. "And now they're my problem?" Maggie's gaze softened. "No, Eli. Now they're your chance to do something right." Back in town, Eli felt the weight of that chance as he stepped into the general store. Conversations hushed as he approached the counter, the usual hum of small-town gossip replaced by pointed stares. A neighbor leaned against a shelf, arms crossed. "Taking on strays now, Eli?" the man asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone like you." Eli's jaw tightened, but before he could reply, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Give the man a break," Gid said, grinning as he leaned against the counter. "Takes a big heart to care for a mama and her pups. Not that you'd know much about that." The room filled with a smattering of chuckles, but the tension lingered as Eli grabbed his supplies and left. Gid caught up with him outside, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let them get to you, Thatcher. You're doing good work." Eli's grunt of acknowledgement was all he could manage, but Gid's words stayed with him as he returned to the cabin. Night had fallen when the first sign of trouble stirred outside the cabin. Ellie's ears perked, her body tense as she caught the faint rustling near the porch. A low growl escaped her throat. A raccoon, its eyes glinting in the moonlight, edged closer to the puppies. Without hesitation, Ellie lunged, her barks fierce and unrelenting. The raccoon scurried off, disappearing into the shadows. Ellie stood her ground for a moment longer before returning to her pups, checking each one carefully. Eli watched from the doorway, his chest tightening at her bravery. "You're something else, girl," he murmured. But the night held another shadow. Wes Morgan's truck idled just beyond the tree line, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of Eli's cabin. "Soon," he muttered, the word a promise as he drove off, leaving deep tire tracks in the mud. Inside, the cabin was quiet once more. Eli worked at his kitchen table, the faint sound of his pencil scratching against paper filling the room. Ellie lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her eyes following his every move. Eli glanced at her, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. "You're not making this easy, girl," he said, a small smile breaking through his usual gruff demeanor. Ellie thumped her tail against the floor, her gaze steady and filled with trust. For the first time in a long time, Eli felt the weight of his walls begin to lift. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing Eli's cabin in a soft, golden light. Inside, the puppies scrambled around Ellie, yipping with excitement as she guided them toward the food bowls Eli had set out. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The pups were stronger now, their tiny bodies brimming with energy. "You've got quite the crew here, Ellie," he muttered, watching as the smallest pup tried to nudge its sibling out of the way. Ellie, ever the vigilant mother, nudged the offender gently but firmly, restoring order. Eli had fallen into a routine that he didn't realize he'd grown fond of, feeding Ellie and her pups, cleaning their bedding, and taking breaks to watch them explore the world around the cabin. Each day, their growth reminded him of new beginnings, though the weight of his past still lingered, casting a shadow over his budding bond with the animals. The bustling energy of Asheville's Saturday Farmers Market was a sharp contrast to the quiet serenity of Eli's cabin. Vendors called out their wares, and the scent of fresh produce and baked goods filled the air. Eli maneuvered through the crowd, a bag slung over his shoulder. He'd come for better quality food for Ellie and her pups, something Maggie had convinced him to prioritize. "Eli," Maggie called, weaving through the crowd with a broad smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Needed some things," he replied gruffly, though the corners of his mouth twitched upward. As they chatted, Gid joined them, balancing a box of fresh dog biscuits in one hand and a steaming coffee cup in the other. "You're turning into a proper dog dad, Thatcher," he teased, clapping Eli on the back. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. A group of townsfolk nearby exchanged whispers, their pointed glances making no effort to hide their judgment. One woman approached, her arms crossed. "Taking on strays is noble, Eli," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "But you sure you can handle it? They need more than just scraps and sympathy." Eli's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Maggie stepped in, her voice firm but polite. "Ellie and her pups are in good hands. Maybe you should worry about your own backyard." From across the market, a figure watched the exchange closely. Dressed in a worn baseball cap pulled low over his face, Wes Morgan's lips curled into a smirk. He turned and melted into the crowd, his mind already working on his next move. Deputy June McAllister tapped her pen against the edge of her desk, scanning the complaint filed by Wes Morgan. The details were vague, but the claim was clear. Abandoned animals that supposedly belonged to him were now in someone else's care. She frowned, her instincts tingling. "Wes Morgan," she said aloud. Sheriff Wade leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Not exactly the town's most credible source. "I know," she replied, standing and grabbing her jacket. "But I'll check it out. If there's something shady, I'll find it." "Be careful," Wade cautioned. "Morgan's trouble." That evening, the peaceful rhythm of Eli's routine was shattered. Ellie's frantic barking pulled him from his chair, and he rushed outside to find her circling the porch, her eyes darting toward the dark forest. "Where are they?" Eli muttered, grabbing his flashlight. His heart sank when he counted only 2 puppies. The search was tense and disorienting, the forest alive with eerie sounds and shifting shadows. Ellie darted ahead, her movements urgent. Finally, Eli spotted the missing pup, its tiny body trapped in a tangle of thorns. "Gotcha," he whispered, carefully freeing the trembling pup. Ellie was at his side in an instant, her nose nudging the pup as if to reassure it. Together they returned to the cabin, Eli's mind racing with the realization of how much he'd come to care for them. The beam of a flashlight caught his attention as they neared the clearing. A voice called out, calm but commanding. "Everything okay here?" Eli turned to see Deputy McAllister approaching, her badge glinting in the light. "Heard the commotion," she said. "Thought I'd check it out." She crouched, extending a hand toward Ellie. The Beagle hesitated, but allowed the touch, her protective nature tempered by exhaustion. June straightened, her gaze thoughtful. "She's a fighter," she remarked. "Seems like she's found a good place." The following day, Maggie convinced Eli to bring Ellie and her pups to a church fundraiser, hoping to drum up support. The event was a mix of curiosity and tension. While many attendees cooed over the puppies and offered donations, a vocal minority muttered accusations. "Trying to play the hero now, Thatcher?" one man sneered. "This isn't a charity case." Ellie, seemingly unfazed, became the center of attention when a small child tripped near her. Without hesitation, she moved to the boy's side, nudging him gently until he giggled. The scene softened even the harshest critics, and Maggie leaned over to whisper, "She's winning hearts, one tail wag at a time." Back at his trailer, Wes paced like a caged animal. His debts were piling up, and the gossip around town only fueled his desperation. "If people think he's some kind of saint," Wes growled, "then I'll show them otherwise." He picked up his phone, calling an old associate to spread rumors about Eli's neglect. The next call was a darker one, arranging a late-night visit to Eli's property. That night, Eli sat at his table, the sketches for a larger shelter taking shape. He ran a hand over his face, exhaustion evident, but the determination in his eyes burned brighter than ever. He could feel Evie's presence in the room, her dream whispering through his thoughts. "I think we might actually do this," he murmured. Outside, a faint noise broke the stillness. Ellie growled softly, standing over her pups. Eli grabbed his flashlight and a bat, stepping cautiously onto the porch. The beam of light illuminated fresh tire tracks near the edge of his property. "Who's out there?" Eli called into the darkness, his voice steady, but his grip tightening. Ellie's growl deepened, her body tense and ready, and the morning sun struggled to pierce through the lingering haze from the previous night's storm. Eli stepped out of his cabin, his boots crunching on the damp ground. His gaze fell on the tire tracks etched in the mud near the property's edge, a stark reminder of the unease creeping into his once secluded life. Deputy June McAllister pulled up in her cruiser, stepping out with her notepad in hand. She crouched by the tracks, inspecting them with a furrowed brow. "These are fresh," she said, glancing up at Eli. "You hear anything last night?" Eli nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, noise woke me up. Didn't see anyone, though." Ellie, who had been sitting on the porch, growled softly, her eyes fixed on the woods beyond. She paced nervously, her unease palpable. "This doesn't feel random, Eli," June said, standing and brushing off her hands. "Someone's watching you." "That's what worries me," Eli replied, his voice low. He looked at Ellie, her vigilance echoing his own rising anxiety. Wes Morgan slumped in a worn recliner inside his cluttered trailer, the scent of stale smoke and spilled beer thick in the air. Across from him sat Denny Pratt, a wiry man with sharp eyes that darted around the room like a predator assessing its prey. "We'll hit his place tonight," Wes said, his voice laced with desperation. Get the dog and her pups. Sell them quick. Pay off some of these vultures circling me. Denny smirked, lighting a cigarette. You're playing a risky game, Wes. You sure this Thatcher guy won't put up a fight? Wes's eyes narrowed, his hand gripping the armrest tightly. He won't have a choice. The crack in Wes's composure betrayed his unraveling mental state. Every passing day deepened his debts and fueled his resolve to reclaim what he believed was his. At Maggie's clinic, Ellie and her puppies huddled close as Maggie completed their checkup. They're healthy, she said, wiping her hands on her scrubs. But I don't like what I'm hearing about those tracks near your place. Eli sighed, his shoulders heavy with weariness. Feels like I'm being pushed into a corner. Maggie's expression softened. Then push back. Install some security. Get cameras, lights, anything to deter them. Eli nodded, appreciating her practical advice, but his focus shifted as he overheard a snippet of gossip from a nearby customer. They say he's neglecting those dogs, the man muttered. Should have left them to someone more capable. The words stung, though Eli outwardly ignored them. Maggie touched his arm gently. You're doing right by Ellie, no matter what they say. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Back at the cabin, Ellie's heightened awareness was impossible to miss. Every sound drew a low growl or a sharp bark. Eli noticed the way she positioned herself near the pups, her body tense and ready to defend them at any moment. You've got instincts sharper than mine, girl, Eli muttered, watching her pace. Her protectiveness reassured him, even as it reminded him of the danger closing in. The puppies provided small moments of levity, tumbling over each other in clumsy games. Their innocent antics offered a temporary escape from the weight pressing on Eli's shoulders. Later that day, Eli visited Gid's garage. The mechanic was elbow-deep in the engine of an old pickup when Eli arrived. Well, look who's here, Gid said, grinning. Come to tell me Ellie's running circles around you? Eli managed a wry smile. Actually, I need your help. Got some unwelcome visitors lately. Gid wiped his hands on a rag and listened intently as Eli explained the situation. Without hesitation, Gid offered his help, his tone turning serious. We'll get some motion sensor lights set up. Cameras, too. If someone's creeping around, they won't stay invisible for long. Thanks, Eli said, his gratitude evident. Gid clapped him on the shoulder. Hey, you've got yourself a little army there, Eli. Don't worry, we'll keep 'em safe. That night, the air was heavy with tension. Ellie's barking jolted Eli awake just before midnight. Grabbing his flashlight and bat, he rushed to the porch. The beam of his light cut through the darkness, illuminating two figures crouched near the kennel. Get out of here, Eli bellowed, his voice echoing through the stillness. The intruders froze before scrambling back toward the woods, but not before one of them nailed a note to a nearby tree. Eli approached cautiously, his breath visible in the chilly night air. The note was scrawled in jagged letters. They're mine. Stay out of this. Ellie stood by his side, her growl low and steady. Eli crumpled the note in his hand, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Not on my watch, he muttered. News of the confrontation spread quickly, dividing the small town further. At a hastily arranged town hall meeting, opinions clashed like thunderclouds. They're just dogs, one skeptic argued. Is all this trouble worth it? Maggie stood, her voice calm but firm. Ellie is more than just a dog. She's a survivor, and she's shown more courage than most of us would in her place. Gid chimed in, his humor disarming the tension. Besides, if we let people like Wes Morgan win, what does that say about us? Despite their efforts, skepticism lingered, though a few murmurs of agreement hinted at shifting perspectives. Back at the cabin, Ellie proved her worth once again. While Eli worked on reinforcing the shelter, one of the puppies wandered dangerously close to the ravine's edge. Ellie sprinted after it, nudging the pup back to safety just before it could tumble over. Eli's heart pounded as he watched, his admiration for Ellie growing. "You're something special," he murmured, scratching behind her ears. As dusk settled over Wes's trailer, his desperation reached a boiling point. "If I can't sell those dogs," he ranted to Denny, "I'll make sure no one else gets them." Denny raised an eyebrow, clearly uneasy. "You're talking crazy, Wes." "Crazy gets results," Wes snapped, his eyes wild. The tension between them was thick, hinting at the chaos to come. That night, Eli and Gid worked late into the evening, securing the property with stronger locks and additional lighting. Ellie watched from the porch, her tail wagging faintly as if sensing their determination. "This isn't just about Ellie anymore," Eli said quietly, his gaze steady. "It's about standing up to people like Wes, people who think life doesn't matter unless it's profitable." Gid nodded, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Then let's make sure they don't win." The sunrise painted Eli's cabin in hues of orange and gold, a peaceful contrast to the storm of tension brewing inside him. He sipped his coffee on the porch, watching the puppies tumble over one another in the yard. Ellie stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning the tree line, her instincts sharp as ever. The fleeting calm shattered with the crunch of gravel as Deputy June McAllister's cruiser pulled into the driveway. Her face was serious, her presence foreboding. "Morning, Eli," she said, stepping out and adjusting her belt. "We need to talk." Eli leaned against the porch railing, his jaw tightening. "This about those tracks again?" "Worse," she replied, her tone somber. "Wes Morgan's filed an official claim, says Ellie and her puppies belong to him." For a moment Eli was silent, the words hanging in the crisp morning air like a storm cloud. "He abused her," Eli said finally, his voice laced with anger. "How am I supposed to prove that?" June sighed. "I don't believe his story, Eli. But the law's the law. Without evidence, he could take them back." Ellie, sensing the tension, growled low, her stance protective. Eli placed a calming hand on her head, but the frustration in his eyes was unmistakable. "Proof," he muttered, shaking his head. "How do I prove what that man did to her?" Later that morning, Ellie began acting strangely, sniffing around the edges of the property and barking at nothing Eli could see. Her unease was contagious, pulling Eli into her frantic energy. Following her lead, he crouched by her side as she pawed at the ground near an old tree stump. His breath caught when he saw it, a jagged scar hidden beneath her fur. He ran his fingers gently over it, Ellie flinching slightly but not pulling away. Eli wasted no time. By mid-morning, he was at Maggie's clinic. "She's got a scar," he said, his voice tense. "It's not from anything recent. Looks like she's been through hell." Maggie inspected Ellie with a furrowed brow. "This," she said, pointing to the scar, "is consistent with injuries I've seen in overbred dogs, probably forced into back-to-back litters." She looked up at Eli, her expression grim. "This could be your proof." Eli's hands tightened into fists. "Wes did this, and he thinks he can just take her back." Maggie nodded. "I'll reach out to a local animal welfare group. If Wes has a history of this, they'll find it." For the first time that day, hope flickered in Eli's chest. Meanwhile, Wes paced inside his trailer, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of stale alcohol. His anger boiled over as he ranted to Denny. "Thatcher's got no right to my dogs," he spat, slamming a fist onto the table. Denny, leaning back in his chair, looked unimpressed. "You've got bigger problems, Wes. Loans don't pay themselves." "I'll deal with that after I get them back," Wes snarled, If the law won't back me up, I'll do it my way." Denny raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Wes's desperation had crossed into dangerous territory, and even Denny wasn't sure how far he'd go. At Maggie's urging, Eli reluctantly attended a community meeting at the local town hall. The room buzzed with energy, half the townsfolk gossiping while the other half debated Wes's claims. Maggie gave Eli an encouraging nudge. "Just tell them the truth." Eli stood, his hands gripping the back of a chair for support. "Ellie and her pups. They're survivors," he began hesitantly. "She's been through more than most of us could imagine, and all she's done since I found her is protect those pups with everything she has." A murmur spread through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, while others crossed their arms skeptically. Gid, ever the comic relief, chimed in. "And let's not forget, she's got a mean bark. Scared the pants off me the first time I met her." Laughter rippled through the room, breaking some of the tension. Eli met Maggie's eyes, finding strength in her quiet support. By the end of his speech, a few more townsfolk had pledged their help, but the divide was clear. That evening, as the sky turned a soft indigo, Eli sat on the porch with Ellie by his side. The puppies were curled up in their makeshift bed inside the cabin, their tiny snores barely audible. Eli glanced down at Ellie, scratching behind her ears. "You've turned my whole world upside down, you know that," he said softly. "And I'm starting to think, maybe that's not such a bad thing." Ellie lifted her head, resting it on his knee. Her eyes, filled with trust and understanding, met his. The moment was quiet, unspoken, but it solidified the bond between them. That night, the quiet shattered. Wes and Denny crept onto the property, their dark silhouettes blending into the shadows. Ellie's sharp bark woke Eli instantly. Grabbing his flashlight and bat, he stepped onto the porch, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Wes stepped forward, a knife glinting in his hand. "Hand over the dog," he growled. "This doesn't have to get ugly." Ellie moved in front of Eli, her growls deep and menacing. When Wes lunged, Ellie didn't hesitate. She barked fiercely, snapping her jaws and driving him back. The ferocity in her eyes was enough to send Wes and Denny retreating into the night, but not before Wes shouted, "This isn't over!" Eli stood frozen for a moment, the bat heavy in his hand. He looked down at Ellie, who stood firm, her body trembling, but her resolve unbroken. "You're braver than me, girl," he muttered, his voice filled with both awe and gratitude. The next morning, word of the break-ins spread quickly. Neighbors began arriving at the cabin, bringing supplies and offering their support. One elderly woman handed Eli a sack of dog food with a kind smile. "Not everyone believes the lies, Eli. You're doing good here." Deputy June arrived as well, her respect for Eli evident. "You handled yourself well last night," she said. "I'll keep digging into Wes's past. We'll find something." Maggie, ever the optimist, added, "People are starting to see the truth, Eli." "You're not alone in this." Eli nodded, glancing at Ellie, who lay protectively beside her pups. "I just want them to be safe." In his trailer, Wes sat alone. The once loud presence of Denny was gone, leaving only the sound of his muttered curses. His hands trembled as he poured another drink, his rage bubbling over. "If I can't have them," he whispered to himself, "no one will." As dusk fell over Eli's cabin, he worked tirelessly to finish the last of the security measures. Gid and Maggie helped, their camaraderie lightening the mood despite the lingering tension. Ellie sat on the porch, her ears perked, her stance alert. She watched the woods intently, her low growl barely audible as Eli stood beside her. "Whatever comes next," Eli muttered, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We're ready." The morning sun bathed Eli's cabin in soft light. but the remnants of the previous night's chaos still lingered. Broken locks, deep ruts in the ground, and faint scratches on the porch were stark reminders of Wes's intrusion. Eli stood silently, surveying the damage, his jaw clenched as he resolved to make things right. Gid arrived shortly after, armed with tools and his ever-present sense of humor. "Figured you could use a hand," he said, clapping Eli on the back. "Though I'd recommend a moat next time." Despite the tension, the sight of Ellie and her puppies brought moments of levity. The pups, now braver and more curious, ventured onto the porch, their tiny barks adding a warmth to the cold reality. Ellie, ever watchful, stayed close to them, her eyes scanning the tree line. As Eli hammered a new lock into place, he glanced at Ellie. "We'll keep you safe," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Ellie, as if understanding, wagged her tail faintly, her gaze never leaving the woods. Later that day, Eli brought Ellie and the puppies to Maggie's clinic. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and hope, and Ellie seemed calmer than usual, sensing the familiarity of the place. Maggie greeted them with a folder in hand. "I've been busy," she began, her expression a mix of triumph and concern. "Wes has a history, and not the kind you'd put on a resume." She laid out her findings, financial records tying Wes to an underground breeding operation, complaints from previous neighbors, and even evidence of illegal sales. "This is enough to start a case," Maggie said, "and the animal welfare group I contacted is ready to help." Eli exhaled, a weight lifting slightly. This could turn the tide. "It will," Maggie assured him, "but we need the town behind us." By evening, the community center buzzed with activity as Maggie and Gid rallied the townsfolk. Eli stood near the back, uncomfortable in the spotlight, but determined to protect Ellie. Maggie presented the evidence, her voice steady and clear. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she detailed Wes's actions. One woman clutched her chest. How could anyone treat animals like that? The support was overwhelming. Donations poured in, materials for fencing, food, even offers to take shifts patrolling Eli's property. But the skepticism lingered in some corners. A gruff man in the back muttered, "This is just stirring up trouble." Deputy June McAllister addressed the crowd next. "We're officially investigating Wes Morgan," she announced. "But this is a community effort. Standing together is the only way to protect what's right." Eli, for the first time, felt the tide beginning to turn. That night, Ellie barked sharply, dragging Eli outside. Near the barn, he found a crude trap, a rusted cage with jagged edges. His stomach turned at the thought of Ellie or her puppies getting caught. "This is Wes," he muttered, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. Ellie stood beside him, her tail stiff, her growls low and continuous. "He's not going to stop," Eli said, more to her than anyone else. The next morning, Eli met Caleb Ross at the diner. Caleb was lean and sharp-eyed, with the air of someone who'd seen enough injustice to last a lifetime. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Caleb leaned forward. "I've heard about Wes Morgan," he said. "He's the kind of man who thinks the law bends to his will. Let's show him otherwise." Eli raised an eyebrow. "Why help me? You don't even know me." Caleb smiled faintly. "I know people like you, quiet, determined, and willing to fight for what's right. And I know people like him. That's enough." Meanwhile, in Wes's trailer, the atmosphere had grown darker. Denny, fed up with Wes's erratic behavior, packed his things and left without a word. Alone, Wes paced the small space, muttering under his breath. His plans were spiraling out of control, and desperation painted every word he spoke. "If they think they've won," he hissed, "they've got another thing coming." Late that night, Eli sat at his kitchen table, a pen in hand and a piece of paper in front of him. The words came slowly but deliberately, a letter to himself, a promise to honor Evie's memory by protecting Ellie and her puppies. Ellie padded over, resting her head on his lap. He scratched behind her ears, the moment quiet but profound. "You've given me a reason to fight," he whispered. The climactic moment came during a community event in downtown Asheville. Wes appeared suddenly, his face twisted with anger. "You stole from me, Thatcher!" he bellowed, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The crowd fell silent as Wes accused Eli of theft, his voice rising with every word. Ellie, standing beside Eli, growled low, her protective stance clear. Deputy June stepped between them, her hand on her holstered weapon. "That's enough, Morgan. Leave now, or you're under arrest." Wes sneered but backed off, muttering threats under his breath as he disappeared into the crowd. The townsfolk murmured, some siding with Eli, others shaking their heads in doubt. As dusk fell back at the cabin, Caleb and Maggie joined Eli to strategize. Caleb was confident. "We've got everything we need to win this. Wes is all bluster." Eli nodded, but his eyes were on Ellie, who stared into the woods, her ears perked. She let out a single bark, the sound cutting through the quiet. "Not tonight, girl," Eli said, his voice steady. "We're ready for whatever comes." The morning light streamed through the windows of Eli's cabin, catching motes of dust as Caleb Ross spread out a stack of papers on the kitchen table. Maggie sat beside him, flipping through veterinary records, while Gid leaned back in his chair, a cup of coffee in hand. Ellie lay on the floor nearby, her puppies curled up in a corner, oblivious to the tension in the room. "We've got everything we need," Caleb said confidently, pointing to a highlighted document. Maggie's records, the photos and the testimonies paint a clear picture of neglect and abuse. Eli sat across from him, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not a lawyer, Caleb. I just want to do right by Ellie." Caleb met his gaze. "And that's exactly why we're going to win. You're not just her caretaker, Eli. You're her family." Maggie reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Eli's arm. "Trust us. The truth will speak for itself." The Asheville County Courthouse buzzed with activity as the community gathered for the trial. The air inside was thick with anticipation, a mix of curiosity and tension. Eli walked in, his shoulders squared but his nerves evident. Ellie trotted beside him, her leash loosely held in his hand, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. At the plaintiff's table sat Wes Morgan, his unkempt appearance doing little to inspire sympathy. His lawyer, a disinterested man with a perpetually furrowed brow, shuffled papers half-heartedly. In contrast, Caleb exuded quiet confidence as he arranged his files, his gaze steady and unwavering. The proceedings began with Wes's lawyer arguing that Ellie and her puppies were his property, citing the lack of official ownership transfer. "Without papers," the lawyer droned, "there's no legal basis for Mr. Thatcher to claim these animals." Caleb rose smoothly, his voice calm but commanding. "Ownership comes with responsibility, Your Honor. Neglect and abuse void any claim of property." He presented Maggie's veterinary records, detailing Ellie's injuries and malnourishment when Eli found her. Photos of Ellie's scar and the underweight puppies circulated among the jury and onlookers, eliciting murmurs of sympathy. Gid was the first to testify, his easygoing demeanor a balm to the tense courtroom. "That dog didn't just find a home," he said, his voice steady. "She gave Eli a reason to keep going." Maggie followed, her professional expertise lending credibility. "Ellie's injuries are consistent with overbreeding," she explained. "She was treated as a commodity, not a living being." Even a few townsfolk who had doubted Eli initially stepped forward, recounting how his care for Ellie had inspired them to reconsider how they treated animals. The testimonies painted a vivid picture of Ellie's transformation under Eli's care. The turning point came when Wes, under mounting pressure, lost his temper. "He stole them," Wes shouted, pointing at Eli. "I raised that dog. I bred her." Caleb seized the moment, his voice sharp. "So, you admit to overbreeding her for profit?" Wes faltered, his face reddening as the courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge pounded her gavel, silencing the room, but leaving Wes visibly shaken. During a recess, Ellie caught the attention of a young child in the hallway. The boy, shy at first, extended a tentative hand. Ellie sniffed it before gently nudging his palm, earning a giggle. The judge, observing the interaction from a distance, requested to see Ellie interact with Eli in the courtroom. As Ellie sat at Eli's feet, her eyes fixed on him with unshakable trust, the judge's expression softened. "It's clear," the judge said, her voice firm. "This dog doesn't just see you as her owner, Mr. Thatcher. She sees you as her family." When the ruling came, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge's words cut through the silence. "Based on the evidence presented, it's clear that Mr. Morgan has neglected his responsibilities and mistreated these animals. Custody is awarded to Mr. Thatcher, who has demonstrated consistent care and commitment." Cheers erupted from Eli's supporters, while Wes stormed out, muttering threats under his breath. Caleb placed a steadying hand on Eli's shoulder. "We did it," he said quietly. "But this isn't over." Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was jubilant. Children petted Ellie and the puppies, their laughter filling the air. Maggie and Gid exchanged relieved smiles as Eli thanked the townsfolk who had come to his defense. But as the crowd dispersed, a lingering unease crept over Eli. "He's not done," he murmured to Caleb. "I know," Caleb replied grimly, "but neither are we." Miles away, Wes sat in his trailer, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a knife in the other. The room was dark, save for the flickering light of a dying bulb. His muttering grew louder, more incoherent, until he slammed the bottle onto the table. "If I can't have them," he hissed, "no one will." That evening, Eli stood on his porch, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. Ellie lay at his feet, her ears twitching at every sound from the woods. Eli reached down, scratching behind her ears. "We've come this far, girl," he said softly. "We're not giving up now." From the edge of the tree line, a shadowy figure watched silently, the outline barely visible against the darkening sky. Ellie's growl broke the stillness, a low, warning rumble that sent a chill down Eli's spine. The morning air was crisp as Eli hammered the last nail into the fence post, the steady rhythm blending with the playful barks of the puppies tumbling in the yard. Ellie, ever watchful, perched herself near the edge of the property, her ears twitching at the faint rustling of leaves. Eli paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at her with a soft smile. "We did it, girl," he murmured. "Things are finally looking up." The sense of calm felt almost surreal, like the world had finally stopped testing him. But there was an unease that lingered beneath the surface. Ellie's pacing, her eyes scanning the woods as if she sensed something unseen. Miles away, the tension inside Wes Morgan's trailer was suffocating. The small, cluttered space reeked of alcohol and frustration as Wes slammed an empty bottle onto the table. His muttering grew louder, his movements more erratic as he gathered a canister of gasoline and a box of matches. His plan had crystallized in his mind. If he couldn't have Ellie, neither could Eli. "This'll teach him," Wes snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "He'll regret the day he crossed me." The storm clouds gathering outside mirrored the brewing chaos within Wes's fractured mind. As evening fell, Ellie's behavior grew more frantic. She barked at every shadow, paced the porch and circled the yard, her restlessness infectious. Eli watched her from the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What's gotten into you, girl?" he asked, stepping onto the porch. Ellie barked sharply in response, her gaze fixed on the darkening woods. The first drops of rain began to fall, and the faint rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. "Just a storm," Eli muttered, more to himself than to her. But Ellie's instincts told her otherwise. The storm had fully set in by midnight, lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, eerie flashes. Ellie's low growls roused Eli from a restless sleep. Grabbing a flashlight, he moved toward the door, his heart pounding. The faint smell of smoke reached him just as Ellie's barking turned ferocious. Eli stepped outside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the rain. His blood ran cold as he spotted Wes near the barn, a flickering flame in his hand. "Wes!" Eli shouted, the wind carrying his voice. "What the hell are you doing?" Wes didn't answer. Instead, he hurled the lit accelerant toward the barn, the flames catching instantly. Adrenaline surged through Eli as he grabbed the fire extinguisher he'd kept by the door since the last incident. Rushing toward the barn, he was intercepted by Wes, who swung a tire iron wildly. Eli dodged, raising his shovel defensively. "You don't get to ruin my life!" Wes bellowed, his face contorted with rage. "She's mine!" The two men grappled, the storm intensifying around them. Ellie's growls turned into action as she lunged at Wes, snapping at his arm and forcing him to drop the tire iron. Her bravery gave Eli the opening he needed to extinguish the flames before they consumed the barn. The sounds of barking and shouting drew the attention of the neighbors. Gid arrived first, flashlight in hand, followed by Maggie and several others. Deputy June arrived shortly after, her patrol car's sirens piercing the night. "Drop it, Wes," June commanded, her gun drawn. Wes hesitated, his face a mask of defeat before raising his hands. The cuffs clicked into place, and he glared at Eli as he was led away. "You think this is over?" Wes spat. "You'll pay for this." June looked at Eli, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You handled yourself well tonight," she said, "but we'll need to talk about adding more security." By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a damp but peaceful morning. Ellie lay on the porch, her head resting on Eli's knee as he surveyed the repaired barn. The puppies tumbled in the yard, blissfully unaware of the night's events. "You saved us, girl," Eli said softly, scratching Ellie's ears. "You're the bravest soul I know." At the sheriff's office, Wes faced a slew of charges, including arson and animal cruelty. Deputy June uncovered additional evidence linking Wes to illegal activities, ensuring he'd face significant consequences. The community, once divided, began to rally fully behind Eli. That evening, Caleb arrived at the cabin with news. "There's a grant program for animal rescue centers," he explained. "We could turn this place into something special, a legacy for Ellie and these pups." Eli nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the yard where Ellie stood, her ears perked and her tail wagging faintly. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. As the night settled in, the cabin glowed with warmth, a sanctuary forged through resilience and love. Ellie lay at Eli's feet, her watchful eyes scanning the horizon, ever the protector. The week following Wes's arrest was a whirlwind of repairs, reflection, and renewal. Eli sat on his porch, pen in hand, staring at the blank page of a notebook. The once damaged cabin was now fortified, every plank and nail a testament to the community that had rallied around him. Ellie lay at his feet, her watchful eyes scanning the yard where her puppies tumbled over one another in playful chaos. Eli began to write, his words coming slowly at first. "To the man I was," he penned, his hand steady. "You were lost, stubborn, and too afraid to see the joy waiting outside your door. Ellie changed that. She changed everything." The scratch of his pen filled the quiet morning air, each word a catharsis for the man who had built walls around himself for so long. At the town's community center that evening, a gathering buzzed with excitement. Maggie stood at the front, her voice strong and clear. "Ellie's story has inspired something bigger," she announced. Today, we're launching the Asheville Animal Welfare Initiative with plans to establish a rescue center right here on Eli's property. Applause filled the room, but Eli's hesitance was visible. Gid leaned over, nudging him. "Come on, Eli, you've already started something special. Might as well see it through." Eli cleared his throat, standing awkwardly. "I don't know much about running a rescue, but if Ellie can trust me, maybe the rest of you can too." Laughter and cheers erupted, and for the first time, Eli allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd accomplished and what was still to come. The next day, Maggie performed a final checkup on Ellie's puppies. Their energy was boundless as they scrambled over one another, tails wagging furiously. Eli knelt beside them, his fingers brushing over their soft fur. "They're ready for adoption," Maggie said gently, sensing Eli's reluctance. "Most of them already have homes lined up." Eli nodded, his throat tight. "It's what's best for them," he said, though the words felt heavy. One puppy, the smallest of the litter, climbed into his lap and nuzzled his hand. Maggie smiled. "Looks like this one's already decided where she belongs." Eli laughed softly, holding the tiny pup close. "Guess I can't argue with that." The opening of the Asheville Animal Rescue Center was a modest but heartfelt affair. A small crowd gathered as Maggie unveiled a plaque honoring Ellie, her name etched alongside the words resilience and bravery. Eli stood to the side, watching as Ellie padded around the yard, greeting visitors with her wagging tail. "Look at her," Gid said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. "She's the queen of this place." "She's earned it," Eli replied, his voice filled with quiet pride. One crisp afternoon, Eli visited Evie's grave, a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. Ellie followed him, her steps slow and deliberate, as if sensing the solemnity of the moment. "I wish you could have met her," Eli said, his voice soft. "Ellie's got your spirit, Evie. She doesn't give up no matter what." He placed the flowers gently and pulled out the letter he'd written. "I've spent years carrying guilt," he continued. "But she's shown me that it's not too late to start over. I'll make you proud. I promise." Ellie pressed her nose to Eli's hand, her presence a quiet comfort. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, a young woman arrived at Eli's cabin. Introducing herself as a journalist, she explained how Ellie's story had gained national attention. "People need stories like hers," she said. "Stories of hope and second chances." Eli chuckled, scratching Ellie behind the ears. "She's something special, that's for sure." The journalist stayed for hours, capturing every detail of Ellie's journey. Her visit left Eli feeling a mixture of pride and humility, knowing Ellie's impact reached far beyond their small town. Late that night, Ellie barked sharply at the door. Eli, now accustomed to her alerts, grabbed a flashlight and opened it cautiously. A man stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped and his face lined with regret. "I heard about Ellie," he said, his voice shaking. I abandoned my dog years ago. Thought I couldn't handle it, but hearing her story, I want to make things right." Ellie approached cautiously, her tail wagging hesitantly. The man knelt, tears streaming down his face as Ellie nudged his hand. Her small act of forgiveness left everyone present deeply moved. As dawn broke, Eli stood at the edge of the rescue center's yard, watching Ellie and her puppies play alongside newly rescued animals. Caleb arrived with a stack of paperwork and a wide grin. "Good news," Caleb said. "We've got enough funding to expand. The future's looking bright, Eli." Eli smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "We've got our work cut out for us," he replied. "But I'm ready." Ellie trotted over, her eyes shining with trust. Together, they looked out over the property, the morning light casting a golden glow over their shared legacy. Later that day, Eli took Ellie and her now-grown puppy for a walk through the town park. As they strolled, a passerby stopped, recognizing Ellie. "You're Eli, right? I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done." Eli nodded, humbled. "Ellie's the real hero," he said, patting her head. "I'm just lucky she found me." As they continued down the path, Eli glanced at Ellie, her tail wagging as she trotted beside him. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Let's see where the road takes us next." A year had passed since the chaos and heartbreak that brought Ellie into Eli's life. Now the property stood transformed, a haven of hope known as Ellie's Haven. The morning sun painted the fields in golden hues, casting light on the bustling activity. Volunteers moved purposefully, caring for the dozens of animals that now called the rescue center home. Ellie trotted confidently through the grounds, her tail wagging, with her grown puppy, Hope, bounding at her side. Eli stood near the main barn, clipboard in hand. His weathered face held a calm assurance that hadn't been there before. The transformation of the property mirrored the transformation within him, a man who had found purpose and healing in giving others a second chance. That afternoon, Ellie's Haven hosted a press event to highlight its impact over the past year. A journalist adjusted their microphone, smiling as they addressed Eli. "Mr. Tanner, Ellie's story has reached people far beyond Asheville. Donations have poured in, and her journey continues to inspire. How does it feel to be at the center of such a movement?" Eli glanced down at Ellie, who sat loyally at his side. "It's humbling," he said, his voice steady. "Ellie changed my life in ways I didn't expect. If one dog can do that for me, imagine the good we can do together, for people, for animals. This isn't just about her or me. It's about all of us finding a way to care a little more." In the cozy office at the rescue center, Maggie laid out her ambitious plans for a regional education program. "We can't just rescue animals," she said passionately. "We need to teach people how to care for them, how to prevent situations like Ellie's in the first place." Caleb leaned forward, his mind already racing with ideas. "We could offer scholarships for students interested in veterinary sciences," he suggested, "funded by donations tied to Ellie's story." Eli scratched his beard thoughtfully. "It's a lot of attention," he admitted, "but if it helps more animals like Ellie, I'm on board." One quiet morning, a man arrived at Ellie's Haven, his shoulders slumped and his eyes downcast. He hesitated before stepping forward, clutching a photograph of Ellie as a younger dog. I worked for Wes Morgan," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I didn't stop him when I should have. I'm sorry." The man shared harrowing details about Ellie's past, confirming the abuse she endured under Wes's care. Eli's fists clenched at the man's words, but Ellie's calm, steady presence softened his anger. "We can't change the past," Eli said finally, his voice firm but compassionate. "But you've done the right thing by coming forward." The anniversary of Ellie's Haven brought the entire community together. The event was filled with laughter, stories, and heartfelt moments. Gid stood before the crowd, gesturing animatedly as he recounted Ellie's impact on Eli's life. "This stubborn old man found a reason to smile again because of that dog," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, some wiping away tears. Ellie and Hope were presented with small medals to honor their bravery and inspiration. Ellie's calm acceptance of the attention contrasted with Hope's energetic bounds, drawing laughter and admiration from the crowd. That evening, as the celebration quieted, Eli sat on his porch with Caleb and Maggie. The moon cast a gentle glow over the fields, and the sound of crickets filled the air. "This place isn't just mine," Eli said thoughtfully. "It belongs to everyone who believes in second chances. I want to make sure it lasts, even when I'm not the one running it." Maggie smiled, understanding the weight of his words. "We'll make sure it does, Eli." Late that night, as a storm rolled in, Ellie barked at the edge of the property. Eli grabbed his coat and followed her, finding a shivering stray dog huddled near the barn. Ellie approached cautiously, wagging her tail to reassure the frightened animal. The scene mirrored Ellie's first night with Eli, a poignant reminder of how far they'd come. Months later, Ellie and Hope visited a local school as part of the rescue center's new education program. Maggie introduced them to a classroom of wide-eyed children who eagerly reached out to pet the dogs. One child lingered at the back, their hands clasped nervously. Eli knelt beside the child, speaking softly. "Ellie won't hurt you. She's just here to say hello." Slowly, the child reached out, their fear melting as Ellie licked their hand gently. The room erupted in cheers, and Eli smiled, knowing Ellie's impact would ripple far beyond this moment. On a crisp autumn day, Eli walked Ellie, Hope, and a newly rescued dog through the same park where Ellie and her puppies had once wandered alone. The transformation in their lives felt almost surreal. A young couple approached, holding a small puppy they had recently adopted from the center. "Thank you for what you've done," they said, their gratitude evident. "Ellie's story gave us hope." Eli looked down at Ellie, her steady gaze meeting his. "Look at what you started, girl," he said softly, patting her head. "This is your legacy." As they continued down the path, the morning sun bathed them in light, a symbol of the hope and love that now defined their journey. As we close this heartfelt journey of Ellie, her puppies, and Eli, we're reminded of the transformative power of compassion and resilience. Ellie's story isn't just about a dog finding a home, it's about healing, hope, and the incredible impact we can have when we choose kindness over neglect. From abandonment to becoming the heart of a community, Ellie's journey shows us that even the most broken among us can spark change when given a chance. But what do you think? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a story where love and care turned someone's life around, human or animal? What lessons from Ellie's journey resonate most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going because every voice matters in creating a kinder world. If you were moved by Ellie's story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more inspiring tales like this one. And remember to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on the next story that will surely touch your heart. Together, let's continue to celebrate the power of love and second chances. Thank you for watching.